Hello, everyone. My name is Max Fields. I'm the Associate Curator at Photofest, and I'm thrilled to have you here today for this program. Today's conversation with artist Kara Springer is presented in conjunction with a new program series called Texas Talks Art, an unprecedented multi-institutional initiative intended to introduce the work of artists across the state of Texas to a wider audience. Taking the form of virtual 30-minute lunchtime talks, the series features 50 Texas artists and art collectives in conversation with 50 Texas curators beginning in January of 2021. The talks are all free and they all take place every Tuesday at noon. We want to thank everyone at Texas Talks Art for inviting us to participate and their wonderful program. It's truly an honor to be in such good company with so many amazing artists and curators working around the state. Today's talk will focus on the work of artist Kara Springer, who is currently working and living in Houston, where she is an artist in resident at the prestigious core program at the Museum of Fine Arts, Houston. In her work, Springer examines the nature of armatures, the underlying structures that hold the flesh of a body in place. She works with photography, sculpture, and site-specific interventions to explore systems of structural support through engagement with architecture, urban infrastructure, and systems of institutional and political power. She holds degrees from the University of Toronto, ENSCI Les Ateliers in Paris, and the Tyler School of Art in Philadelphia. Her work has been exhibited at the Philadelphia Institute of Contemporary Art, the National Gallery of the Bahamas, the National Gallery of Jamaica, in the Frankfurt Museum of Applied Arts. She's an alumni of the Independent Study Program at the Whitney Museum of American Art and currently holds a fellowship, as I mentioned before, with the Museum of Fine Arts Houston Core Program. We're thrilled to be speaking with Kara today ahead of her inclusion in Photofest's upcoming exhibition, Public Life, Recording the Blur, wherein Springer will be presenting an interpretation of her latest body of work, Oil, as a large-scale photo mural in Photofest's headquarters facade. Before we begin the conversation, we want to acknowledge Photofest partners and sponsors who make our programming and exhibitions possible. This includes the Brown Foundation, the Houston Endowment, National Endowment for the Arts, the Texas Commission on the Arts, City of Houston through the Houston Arts Alliance, the Philip and Edith Leonian Foundation, the Powell Foundation, the Wortham Foundation, the WWW Foundation, the Robert Rauschenberg Foundation, Judith and Gamble Baldwin, Wendy Watrous and Frederick Baldwin, Katie and Michael A. Casey, Martha and David Moore, Nina and Michael Zilka, the Photofest Board of Directors, Silver Street Studios, Island Cloud Services, and generous donors to the Photofest Annual Fund. Without this support, we wouldn't be able to do half of the things, any of the things that we do today. So now that the formal housekeeping is out of the way, and perhaps, Kara, you can join us on video and we can go ahead and start our conversation.
I'm muted. Hi, Max. How you doing?
Hi, Kara. It's good to see you. Thank you again so much for joining us. I'm so thrilled that we're able to talk today. And just for the audience to know, Kara and I have been talking about this program for several months now, and it's just been such an incredible opportunity for me to get to know Kara and to get to know your work. And yeah, so maybe we can go ahead and dive in.
Thank you. Thank you for that. And thank you so much for the invitation to be here with
you. So I know about you, but perhaps you could introduce yourself to the audience as if they're completely unaware of you and your practice. And maybe a place to start is to ask, what are the central questions that drive your art making and research? And what are your primary mediums? And how did you arrive at this methodology?
Sure. So, I mean, in terms of my practice, I'm always asking this question around armature structural support systems. And in a really basic way, I think that that's the question of how do you make a structure stand? And in turn, what are the terms under which something comes apart? And so more and more, I'm understanding that in relationship to care and tending to, and kind of thinking about that in terms of the way in which one must be so attuned to like the context and environment in order to know how a structure might live in relationship to the world around it, how it might actually be sustainable. And so, as you mentioned in your intro, I work with photography, sculpture, site-specific installation. And yeah, it's worth sharing maybe that I trained as an industrial designer. And that very much, so I trained and I also practiced for many years as an industrial designer before kind of making that shift. And it still exists in my life in whatever way. But yeah, I mean, I would say that that certainly informs the materials that I work with, how I come to form. But I think also for me, conceptually, like industrial design gets most interesting and exciting for me in the moments in which it holds the potential for intervening in systems. Yeah, and so for me, there's certainly a connectedness between that training and practice and what I'm doing now in the world.
Brilliant. And perhaps we can get more specific with some images and we can talk a little bit about your earlier work. So I'm going to pull up this image right now because I'm really excited to tell folk or to talk about this work. Can you tell us about your I would say your earlier work, work made before Houston, and perhaps starting with this, and then we can move forward with your other project.
Sure, absolutely. So this is a project that ended up being titled "The Earth and all its inhabitants." So the image that we're looking at is this installation that I did in NASA some years ago in NASA, the Bahamas, and it, in this basic way, it's this ladder that is falling slowly enough that I was able to capture this image. And I took the image while visiting my partner's family over the holidays and kind of sat with it for probably a couple of years on my studio wall, thinking about it. It felt in many ways kind of too beautiful to deal with. Like I wasn't sure if I could do anything with it. And at some point, I was commissioned by Small X Journal for a show that they were doing, a group show called The Visual Life of Social Affliction. And in any case, I ended up developing this into, maybe we can go to the next slide. So into this double-sided light box. And so this is really like a commercial sign that I had produced. And so on either side, there's the image and its mirror. And so for me, it kind of became this portal, and something that was important about it is the fact that it's mobile, so it's battery powered. The idea for me, it was going to be showing in some different places. And the idea for me was that I would show up and build some kind of cart that would allow me myself to move this thing around. And that was really important. And as it turned out, it also was something that was really frustrating and kind of a nuisance for the spaces that it ended up, like when it was in, for example, the National Gallery of the Bahamas, there just wasn't the human power to deal with swapping out these batteries.
Mhm.
Uh, and eventually there were rolling outages, there was a hurricane. So mostly it sat dark in that space. And really, like, I realized that the project became about that and about this kind of ask to tend to this thing and the circumstances in which it was possible to do so, and also when it wasn't.
Yeah, and I think what we'll get to by looking at other examples of your work is this relationship to site and it's like almost it's site responsive or place responsive in a lot of ways. Can you talk about the process in relation to this project a bit? Like tell us a little bit about like I mean you mentioned that it was a bit difficult to sort of dream of an image, but can you talk about not just like how you made the work there, but also how you think about the work as it changes locations, like how presenting this work in Houston, for example, would react or would change the work.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there was something really nice for me about the fact that the first place that this showed was in Nassau, the Bahamas, where the original image was created. And there's certainly a different meaning. So this is actually a digital sketch using an image that I took in Exuma, which is a more rural island in the Bahamas. And in this context, the idea was that it would actually be kind of like not very far away from from the site itself. Um, and there was something for me in the kind of surprise of stumbling upon this in that context. Certainly, I mean, I when the places that it showed, it moved to Little Haiti, sorry, the Little Haiti Cultural Center in Miami. And again, like that was really interesting. I hadn't experienced that place before, and it was really interesting to go there and experience this place that in so many ways felt like the Caribbean that was actually in the United States. Like there was this strangeness of being there. And even the process of negotiating the possibility of this being on meant being in conversation with the women who worked at the front desk of this cultural center and kind of trying to convince and develop relationship in order for this to be able to be maintained. The last place that it showed was in the Netherlands, and I didn't get to go there to do the install, but from what I know, it remained on constantly, and they had the systems in place to just keep it on. And on some level, like in hindsight, it feels almost like that was exhausting. Like there's a kind of, it's almost like that's too much. Even though it probably was my intention initially that this would remain on, after moving through it in the way that I did, I realized that that's not necessarily the ask, you know?
Mhm.
Yeah, yeah.
And perhaps we can talk about how this work. Maybe we'll talk. I'm going to move to. Oops, let me move. Maybe we could talk about the a small matter of engineering a bit. I know I have two slides in here, but
Sure. Actually, Max, do you mind if we talk about the that one first? Sorry,
this,
Depth
yeah,
of Field.
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, the slides have changed, so I'm not sure all of what's there. But yeah, so this is a piece. Maybe I'll just. Do you have the other images that get a little closer to the text?
Yes, yeah.
Okay. Um, yeah, so I mean, I partly was interested in chatting about this work. Like, this is something that looks very different from the rest of my practice. And I tend to not have bodies present in my work, and certainly not my own. And this is something that, so my daughter was born in 2018, which is when this image would have been taken. And and now so this is something that I've kind of been thinking through and developing, and I feel like I'm still, making it. I'll just read a couple of the pieces of text. As I grow more and more obviously pregnant, I begin to notice that it is, with two sole exceptions, one black and one white man, only women of color, primarily black, who get up to offer their seats to me on the train each day. It seems every week there's a new expose about black women dying in childbirth in the United States and in the state of New York, where I happen to be. I am not from here. I think about going home. So the piece becomes about the fact that I found a black midwife, and it maybe I can just read the last. Is there one more slide there?
Mhm.
Thank
Yes. Okay. There we go.
you. So part 6, my body won't stop bleeding after she's born. I lose enough blood to fill a body. Sabine is there. The room fills with women. They look like the women who offered me their seats. I want to close my eyes, but there is always one of them holding my gaze. My pulse disappears and then returns as the women replace the blood through my wrists and ankles. They stem the flow. For 3 days, more women come and go from the room. They save me. I awake and meet my daughter. We go home. Um, yeah, so for me, this is something, I mean, in this moment, I'm kind of reflecting on this in this context of thinking about systems and thinking about, I guess, fragile bodies in relationship to systems, and my own fragile, kind of broken body in relationship to a broken system.
Mhm.
Yeah.
I love that. I love that we're going from the Earth and all its inhabitants to something that's like very much like very personal, like very, and but also this experience that's incredibly relatable because you're talking about care and you're also talking about care work. You're talking about it from an effective point of view and an affected point of view. One of the things that I had a question about when I was looking at this work was your decision, one, to create these chapters. I'm curious to know about that. And then also, while changing the chapters to repeat the image. What does that repetition mean to you? And it's something that comes up in your work a lot, like in your photographic presentations. There's a repetition of a singular or similar image.
Yeah, absolutely. I do notice that I come back to that all the time. And I think for me, there's something in the rhythm that that asks for. Um, and also in terms of an ask, I think often I'm kind of looking at something, and I think this will come up in some of the later projects, but something that's not particularly notable, something that it's easy to disregard, and thinking about what it does to shift frame and kind of force focus um,
Mhm.
in order to in some way force one to look at something with a different kind of contemplation, with possibly reverence, something that they wouldn't otherwise pay attention to. And I think the repetition is part of that, like a part of an ask to look more closely at something.
Mhm.
And here, certainly with the shifting text, and this is an image like both my partner and my mom took basically exactly the same image of me, and for some reason, it just it was something that felt significant. This particular image, but it's often not. It's just the kind of zoning in on something very specific and wanting to stay with it. Yeah, yeah.
Can you talk about, we don't have images of it, but can you talk a little bit about your past exhibition experience working within the realm of conversation and dialogue surrounding care and motherhood? Like I've read some things about your relationship to the Simone Lee exhibition at the New Museum, but and then there was also a project at Project Row. Could you talk about that a bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that'll also come up in a later project. But so Simone Lee in 2016 opened up space through her, I think, a residency at the New Museum, and opened that space up to Black women artists. And eventually, so we began meeting, and eventually that group became a collective called Black Women Artists for Black Lives Matter. Um, and and yeah, that was a really it was a really foundational experience for me, in part because it kind of so I prior to having this kind of art practice, as I mentioned, I was an industrial designer. I made art and I engaged in this way, but it was always, for the most part, in this collaborative community based way. And so it was kind of primarily in contribution to other people's projects. And I kind of shifted course. I decided to go back to school, do my MFA. I did that in Philly, and it was while I was there that I connected with this group, Black Women Artists for Black Lives Matter, and it felt really important for me. It was a kind of returning to the way in which I work, and like being rooted in collective structures and in structures of care. So yeah, so that was really impactful, and that there's another project that we'll talk about, but that is where, well, I'll talk about that when we get there. Um, Sorry, I'm losing track of the question. Am I answering your question at all?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, the point for me is that I'm hopeful that our audience can learn from your experience and your specifically your collaborations and your exhibition making, because I know that we have a bunch of curators and artists on, and so I thought that might be helpful to hear about that evolution. But yeah, perhaps we can move on to some of these images. And I know that there's parts of this that we were not going to focus on too much, but
Yeah,
you know.
for sure. Well, I'll say so. This was actually my thesis project when I was in Philadelphia. And so the image itself, I had been playing with this title of A Small Matter of Engineering, Part One, with these broken plaster structures. And this was my first experience of being inside of a kind of white wall institutional setting in terms of making in this way, and also making work that was intended to show in that kind of context. And so, again, in hindsight, I kind of realized that these images and this like playing with this broken plaster. So this was like a really small piece of linen cast in plaster that was then broken and broken and broken, scanned at high res, printed out really large. I titled this work as this installation, the Elevation series, Don't You Fuck With My Energy, 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 which references a Princess Nokia track. But yeah, I think that in a way, this is site specific in terms of in relationship to the walls around it and of thinking about brokenness and the possibility of breaking these walls. It actually, there was another piece beside this that was titled, If Things Go to Shit, Come Here. And the contents were something like 1,190 bottles of water and I don't know, 1,300 tins of uh, sweet peas, black beans, et cetera, et cetera. And so I had crawled inside of an existing gallery wall and placed those materials there. And so this was like 2017, right after the first Trump election. Um, and there was this practice of like wealthy people building these kind of disaster relief shelters. So in any case, it was this kind of questioning of the possibility that an institutional space might become a refuge in case of civil unrest or global disaster, that we could possibly tear down the walls of such a place to find sustenance.
And I'm curious to know if what the collaboration was with the I mean, I know this is part of your thesis, but with the institution, when you were talking about, because institutional critique comes up in your work a lot, it's, primary. Could you talk about like navigating that a bit? Or did you find it okay?
Well, I mean, maybe when we go to the next piece,
Mhm.
which is connected to this. So, are we still talking about a small matter of engineering part two here? Is that present? Yeah. Okay. So this was. I guess I made this in tandem to developing this other work. But this is connected to what we were talking about. Black women artists for Black Lives Matter. The language of this piece came out of a performance by that collective at the New Museum. I was not in the performance; I was recording it. But um, but yeah, so this piece very much uh, was grounded in my relationship to that institution, I would say, and energetically similarly to the other piece, certainly, it kind of very much grounded in and grappling with the same questions.
Mhm.
Um, and here, so in those terms, perhaps very abstractly, and in these terms more directly. But um, but yeah, I mean, in response to your question about the relationship to the institution, this was kind of a hard learning, like what it was to mount that piece there and then go through the aftermath of it, where, I knew that there would be, this would not be easy work. And I knew that there would be something energetically in dealing with having it in, like this was in the courtyard of Temple University. So, the school that I'm going to every day. It ended up having a life outside of the walls of that institution in an unintended way, but that kind of filtered back into the institution because of a certain attention and energy that, whereby even though this piece was very much intended to be speaking, so this was facing a kind of glass-walled hallway, the main passageway of the building. And so it very much was intended to speak to the institution and to the powers that be in whatever terms. Um, and at the end of the day, it was kind of just like swallowed back into it. Once it had the life that it did, there was this experience of a kind of, promoting, well, this is the work that we encourage our students to make. And so that, so in a really, like that was educational for me. This kind of how it plays out to struggle inside of these places, how it plays out to put energy into challenging, and how that, yeah, yeah. So,
Yeah, to me, it's quite interesting because not only did this work have a life on the campus that was directly informed by the student population in the institution, but then when mass media, could take advantage of any sort of polemics that are challenging, I would say,
mm,
um, it took on an entirely different meaning for so many folks. And I thought it was interesting also to read that, you know, at the same time that Breitbart is making a case against that you also you know, receive recognition from the city, you know, as like top art pick in Philadelphia, a top art moment in Philadelphia, which shows, you know, just this tension between sort of progressive thinking, conceptual artwork, and its sort of influence and ability to influence outside of its original context, but also to participate in the context within which it was critiquing. It's just such a complex project, and I also want to make sure that people also see or are looking at the structure behind the work, the armature. Could you we're moving past another work that's talking very specifically about the material structure, but could you talk about your decision to create the armature that holds this
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this was something I made quite quickly. Like I conceived of it and made it within a few days, and maybe like, yeah, a 24-hour period of building it. And it really was like functionally like, how do I make something that is as large as I want it to, as large as I want it to be?
Mhm.
Um, and yeah, kind of problem solving in those terms. You can see, so essentially it's this frame. Uh, and you can see that there's sandbags that are holding it upright. And something for me, like one of the most interesting things about this for me is the fact that, I mean, it stayed up for quite some time at Temple, and it ended up, it would begin to be blown over as the weather changed, and rain and wind and whatever. It was kind of this big sail that would just get knocked over. And so initially I would go outside with, you know, some friends, put it back up. And then eventually I probably got tired of doing that, but other people started doing it, and they would go out and put it back up and also repair it. And there was something really interesting and lovely about that, in the way that it was clear that it wasn't mine, you know, that there was, again, this kind of presence of collectivity and care, that this feels grounded in for me.
Oh, that's so nice. So moving on, so this is newer work that you've been making while at the core program at the Museum of Fine Arts Houston, and this is part of the conversation that you and I have been having over the past couple of weeks and months, ahead of your exhibition, your participation in the exhibition, Public Life Recording the Blur, which is Photofest's next public art exhibition. Could you talk about how you arrived at this image, what we're actually seeing, and yeah, maybe talk about why you started making this project in Houston.
Yeah, absolutely. So these are high resolution images of oil, thickened oil. So industrial grease, really. And yeah, so this is very like these are these very abstract photos, but this is very much informed by, yes, being in Houston these last couple of years, this specific moment, which is 2020 and 21, being in Houston, in Texas, in the United States, in my body, in this moment. Um, and really the way, yes, I mean, I feel like I can't be here and not be thinking about oil, even my position here. The institution that I have a fellowship with is certainly funded by oil money. It's, you know, it's omnipresent here. Also, in a really basic way, you know, I'm the mom of a small kid. I spend a lot of time in the Natural History Museum. You know, as I mentioned, the fourth floor is the quietest floor there and the best place to be during the pandemic for us. And it's all just sponsored by energy companies.
Yeah.
And so it's all these kind of, you know, quite beautiful diagrammatic exhibitions that demonstrate the way in which energy is harnessed, like the many ways in which energy is harnessed. And yeah, for me, I spend a lot of time up there, and I always was interested in these methods of extraction, and at the same time thinking about extraction and the violence. Oh, I see we're right at the end of our time. Should I? I
No,
should.
I think we can. I think we can finish up. I think we can keep going for a bit.
Okay.
Let's keep-
So yeah, I mean, I'll just say quickly that for me, seeing that very much had me reflecting on the violence of extraction in other terms, in terms of the ways in which resources are violently extracted from vulnerable bodies in the world that we live in
Right.
institutions in the world that we live in whatever terms, in very large terms. And yeah, so I was thinking about this and the possibility of exploring it in these kind of like explicit diagrammatic ways. And instead, I ended up making these really abstract explorations of the material itself. And so yeah, so that wasn't necessarily how I expected to explore it, but I'll say there's something really satisfying about the kind of intimacy of this exploration of it.
Mhm.
And also inside of this, I mean, inside of my practice, I'm always kind of grappling with the question of how far am I allowed to go inside of abstraction, like inside of an abstract practice that doesn't explain itself,
Mhm.
that doesn't offer a kind of translation. And yeah, I struggle there. I have a lot of doubt there. And this is kind of going all the way there for me, which, yeah, is, yeah, something I'm thinking.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting for people, even in this kind of brief window of discussion, to see the various modes within which you work and the ways that you approach materials, and you think about care, and you think about abstraction, the way you talk about abstraction in this, and the way that you talk about it in your other work. The I'm sorry, I've the death-defying feats and everyday abstractions work. It's quite interesting to draw those parallels, and also to see how you're drawing from not only thinking about the place within which you're working, but also your experience within it and your position within it, and also the sort of architecture of everyday life. I think that's quite interesting, and I think for Photofest to show this project in relation to the past year, it takes on another meaning. It's like part of it participates in that sort of abstraction that you're talking about. Whereas I think a lot of folks, perhaps when they see a project of, about or featuring oil, might think, um, this is like a very pointed project where it's really quite open. The dialogue that you and I have been having around this has been quite broad and exploratory. Yeah, so if folks are interested in seeing this work, come and visit Houston because Photofest is putting on is presenting a massive photo banner featuring works from the series. So that'll be interesting to see. Um, I want to make sure that we provide a little bit of room for some Q&A with the audience. If you have time, Cara, if anyone has any questions for the artist, please feel free to enter it into the chat either here or if you're watching in on YouTube. Just give us a shout so that we can um, so that we can address those questions. I do like this in reference to the photographic series um, about your experience of giving birth. Someone writes, "quote We Go Home" is an entire novel. That's really lovely. I'm checking the Q&A. So Adele Nelson is asking, could you talk about what you're working on now following the series that we just discussed? Um, yeah.
Hi, thanks for that question. Yeah, well, I actually, in tandem to developing this project with you, Max, for PhotoFest, I'm also working with the Museum of Contemporary Art in Toronto, which is home for me, one of many. Um, and I'm using some of these prints for a project called "Do I Have to Build You a Fucking Pyramid?" And so that's, in connection to all of these things that we've been discussing, but kind of putting a different kind of form and structure and really like thinking about a structural support in relationship to this. So yeah, I'm pretty centered like here in this material exploration, which honestly, like, yeah, it feels kind of nice to be able to just really get into it.
Thank you, Adele. Does anyone else have another question? Um, give it a few seconds. Yeah, I guess maybe one question that Texas Talks Art um, ends on usually is they ask if you've seen a work of art in a museum in Texas that has been important or inspiring to you. Perhaps you might address that question.
Yeah, absolutely. So no, being in Houston, and I'm near the museum because of the residency. It's been really nice to just have a lot of time to spend with some of the collections here. So, for example, the Rothko Chapel and the Cy Twombly space and this sort of thing, and really just like spending time. And there's a new building at the Museum of Fine Arts Houston. I can't remember the name of it, but up on the top floor, the furthest room, there's a piece by Carrie Mae Weems, and it's part of her kitchen table series. And it's like pretty expansive. Like there's a wall full of these images, which I have been familiar with, but it's and there's also quite a significant amount of text within as well. And I love that I have access to them now. So it's just in the last, I don't know, a couple months that it's open. But I love that I have access to this work now just to spend time with it. Um,
Mm-hmm.
because it feels like a work where there's so much there, and probably for me particularly in this moment. But yeah, that's one that I'm really grateful to have access to.
Yeah. I don't want to skip over this question because I love it. So Adele asked another question, and I love it. And they say, "I love your use of profanity. Can you talk about why and what your aims are with it?" Because I agree. It for me, when you talk about the Princess Nokia, like it's like it injects pop culture, but humor, also levity for connection to an audience.
Um, yeah, I yeah, that's a good question. I mean, in the moments where those titles come up for me, like they're actually really specifically, so in the two projects that I shared here, like they're actually really specifically in relationship to being frustrated and angry in a given context. And it really is just like a kind of gut level, like wanting to say the thing.
Mhm.
And I think for me, there's something about, you know, I make this work that's like quite measured and careful, and you know, like it's not like spray painting a thing on the wall, you know what I mean? Even like I felt like that with the way people do something thing. It's like it's very different to, again, like it, to do it in a way that is quick, and where you feel the emotion of it, as opposed to doing it in a way that feels calculating. And I think I feel like there's a way in which that's like a strategy. Like I feel like I need to prove something, so I need to be like very measured and very like not show all of the actual, you know. And I think that's something I carry in the world.
Mhm.
um, and so the titling for me maybe needs to exist in relationship to that. And I think there's like maybe an interesting, like something happening between those two different modes.
Mhm.
um, yeah, yeah, but thank you for that question.
It reminds me too of a little bit. I mean, you're working with the aesthetics of minimalism and throughout your work, and there's an interruption to the vocabulary of minimalism as like composition A or something to title it. So like I think yeah, I agree. It's like aggressive, but also and to the point, but also yeah, it creates opportunity. I think the like it's humorous, it's funny, and it allows you in, and people can relate to that experience of listening to music, to thinking in very clear terms. I would say it's pretty nice. Let me see if we have any other questions. Nothing now. Um, Cara, thank you so much for joining us. And thank you so much for participating in this. It's so wonderful to talk to you, and I'm so thrilled to be in conversation with you for Texas Talks Art.
Thank you, Max. I'm grateful for all of this.
And I really want to thank the Texas Talks Art folks for organizing this, for reaching out, for making this happen. Specifically, Rebecca Madelon, who was the first to get in touch with me about putting this project on. It's such an honor to be in good company, with curators all around Texas who are all just making amazing shows and thinking really critically when it's a really important time to do that. I want to give them a little bit of a plug. On May 4th, Juyung Choi, an artist from Houston, will be in conversation with Allison DeLima Green, who's a curator at the Museum of Fine Arts Houston. So you definitely want to register for that if you just go to the Texas Talks Art website, which is just texastalksart.org. And if you want to learn more about Kara's exhibition at FotoFest, just visit photofest.org, where you can learn about that show. And then opening, I believe it opens on June 5th, so it's just right around the corner. So you can just drive by on 2000 Edward Street if you're in Houston and see it. I think that's all we have for today. This talk will be archived on Texas Talks Arts website, but also on Photofest's YouTube channel. So if you know somebody who needs to see this, definitely share the link and spread the word. And thanks for joining us.
Yeah.
Bye, everyone.